Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for this, the second installment of our Reimagining Systems series. If you have any technical issues that come up during the program, please use the question bar, and the Council's Vice President for Programs, Haley Boyle, will try to assist you behind the scenes. And later in the hour, we will take some questions from this audience. To ask a question of our speakers, please type it into the question bar. And if your question is selected, I will read it aloud for our guests to answer. So on to our discussion. We're joined this evening by Dr. Michael Kazin, Professor of History at Georgetown University, co-editor of Dissent magazine and co-editor of We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style, and Noah Rothman, associate editor of Commentary magazine and author of Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. As someone who studied in the poetry of the classical canon of philosophy and political economy back in my university days, but then spent a career working in the prose, sometimes just the grunts of practical politics. Our discussion today is kind of a geeky fantasy of mine. Starting in high school, I was making up debates in my head between articles that I had read in Commentary and Dissent. As many of you know, two of the most important journals of opinion in our country for many decades, one of the left and one of the conservative movement. We have the opportunity tonight to see these divergent schools of thought ably represented together here. And I have every expectation that our guests are going to make a lie of the punchline from the old Woody Allen joke that if Commentary and Dissent joined together, they would form dysentery. So to start us off, I want to ask Michael and then Noah to make a few minutes of opening remarks on the question of the recent surge in national conversation about democratic socialism, what it means. Is it a good thing? Why is it happening now? So Michael, take us away.
Well, thanks a lot, Craig, and thanks to Noah for joining in this. No thanks to Woody Allen. I've been plagued by that joke ever since I've been co-editor of Dissent. So. But I guess it'll never leave us. Woody will someday, but the joke never will. And thanks to the World Affairs Council, too, for sponsoring the forum. Well, the first thing to clarify is what are we talking about when we talk about democratic socialism? There's two schools of thought, I think. Some democratic socialists define it quite radically, I think, as a system that would do away with the private ownership of businesses entirely, do away with capitalism entirely in favor of a combination of government ownership and control of businesses by worker cooperatives. This would be democratic because working people, consumers would be controlling, and the majority of the people in the population would be controlling both the means of production and distribution, and also because there would still be elections, free elections. Voters would be able to decide who ran the government and could, if they desired, return the government to a capitalist economy again. And that's sort of pure democratic socialism, if you will, which has never existed in the world, in any society. But most of those in America today call themselves democratic socialists, like Bernie Sanders, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like me, don't favor such a radical transformation of the economy. In Europe, in Scandinavia, and much of the rest of the world, they'd be called social democrats, a term which has never caught on in the United States. That means we would favor programs that are fairly routine in Scandinavian nations and some nations in Western Europe. Programs, I think, over time have produced more equal, more humane, more decent societies than we have here in the US. These programs would include universal quality health insurance paid for by the federal government, and through taxes, of course, affordable housing for all, much cheaper or free public college, robust environmental laws, universal pre-K and kindergarten, a generous family leave policy, and also, very importantly, laws to make it easier to get recognition for labor unions when workers in a given company want one. Now, these are really not new ideas in American history, though they've never been really implemented as fully as social democrats / democratic socialists would want. In fact, some have never been implemented at all. But a start was taken on them during the two great reform eras in US history, neither of which was led by a socialist. And here, as most people would guess if you know any US history, I'm talking about the New Deal, 1930s, to some degree going into the World War II period, and the Great Society of the mid-1960s under Lyndon Johnson. In these years, the US passed programs that began to fulfill some of the goals that I just laid out, which is why Bernie Sanders, when he gives speeches about what he means by democratic socialism, which he's done twice, one in 2015, one in 2019, doesn't refer to any socialist country run by a socialist or communist government. He refers to Franklin Roosevelt, to Lyndon Johnson before his escalation of the war in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, and to Martin Luther King Jr. And only one of these three figures, that is Martin Luther King Jr., even in private, ever defined himself as a democratic socialist. Neither FDR nor Lyndon Johnson ever did. They would have been horrified, perhaps, to hear Bernie Sanders say that he's inspired by them. Sanders keeps referring to the New Deal and the Great Society when he gives speeches defining what he means by democratic socialism. And really the only new addition to this program, which social democrats / democratic socialists have agreed to and have advocated for a long time, would be aggressive action to curb climate change through the Green New Deal or something similar. And this, I think, can only be accomplished by government agencies at all levels, which would regulate private corporations and would subsidize renewable energy sources and products. Now, most democratic socialists, whether of the more radical anti-capitalist variety or the social democratic variety, would also want a lot more democracy in everyday life. That democratic part is very important. We want workers to have a greater voice in the decisions made by their businesses, the way they do in Germany, for example. We want more community involvement in policing, an issue, of course, has come to the fore very dramatically in the last few months. More enforcement of existing antitrust laws and the passage of more aggressive antitrust laws to curb virtual monopolies like Facebook and Amazon, to give smaller businesses a chance to make it in the cyber economy. But what unites all democratic socialists, whether the more radical variety or the social democratic variety, I think, is a determination to change a system that we think is at its base quite unjust. And I'm curious to hear about Noah's book, which I haven't read, which deals with the whole question of social justice, obviously. This, after all, is a system where millions of people have no access to good health care, even during the worst pandemic in 100 years. No access to decent housing, to a job that pays enough to raise a family. Sometimes millions of Americans don't even have enough, especially now during the pandemic, to feed their families. What we support is a system which would guarantee every citizen in the society human dignity, which is actually defined by the Universal Statement on Human Rights passed by the United Nations in the late 1940s. You can call this dignity, you can call it solidarity. At base, we want a society which would give all human beings a sense that they are valuable, inherently valuable, worthy of respect. And to be valuable and worthy of respect, you have to have, the wherewithal to lead a decent life, a life that you can feel that you're a person of self-respect, that you can, hold your head high and not feel like you're bowed down by lack of decent education, lack of good housing, lack of a job. And finally, why has socialism all of a sudden risen, to be a major issue in American politics and American talk about and American culture? I think there's lots of reasons. We can go into them more in detail because I've probably used up my 5 minutes already. But I think clearly the Great Recession has a lot to do with it. And the fact that many young people, especially who favor socialism more than capitalism, according to recent polls, believe that the Great Recession and the aftermath has showed that, in fact, capitalism cannot serve their needs, either their needs for dignity or their needs for, very basic resources to live a decent life. And we can go into more of that when we go back and forth. Thank you.
Thanks. Noah.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Craig. Appreciate this. Thank you to the World Affairs Council. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much, Michael, for the opportunity to discuss this issue. It's of paramount importance. The question that we're here to explore today is the extent to which the rise of democratic socialism is remaking American politics. I think it's hard to argue against the notion that it is remaking democratic politics with alarming swiftness. Events have intervened, and it's easy to forget, but as recently as early February, Bernie Sanders did appear to be on a glide path to the nomination. Now, some resisted what they perceived to be a hostile takeover of a Democratic Party by someone who has only an arm's length relationship with that party, but many others went about making their peace with the prospect of a self-described Democratic Socialist being the party's standard bearer. Columnists and opinion writers like Paul Krugman, Ezra Klein, and Ben Wittes, Senators Gillibrand, Van Hollen, and Cantwell argued in varying degrees that we need to make common cause with socialists. History demonstrates that those who do not are rapidly undermined. And after all, Bernie Sanders isn't really a capital S socialist anyway. And of course, what's so wrong with socialism's goals? These are the wrong questions. It is, as ever, the means by which we would achieve shared objectives that deserve scrutiny. Democratic Socialists, like Michael, just argued that their ideas are no more controversial than that which is commonplace in European-style social democracy, and the resistance to their program is a vestigial remnant of American conservatism. The Democratic Socialists of America are by no means as along the same lines, they're programmatically along the same lines as European Social Democrats if you were to examine their own policies, for example, the policies of Bernie Sanders. One of the approaches that he advocated, a workplace democracy, would transfer shareholder wealth from worker funds and provide that to corporate employees and provide employees with 45% share of board seats. This was attempted in Scandinavia and subsequently abandoned. Washington Post Megan McArdle wrote, quote, "It poisoned labor relations, depressed both investment and productivity growth, and was subsequently abandoned. So too was the wealth tax, which is on its way out of popularity. It had been appealed to by many European states, which discovered that it created incentives to reduce the amount of wealth that was exposed to the government. And in order to create a healthier business climate, it was Europe's social democrats who led the charge to create incentives to create more wealth and keep more wealth in these countries. Likewise, you have people like Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders arguing that we should now turn post offices into banks, public banking. Again, most of the industrialized world is moving away from these policies. The people who are not are the self-described socialists of Europe, not their social democrats. Perhaps the most all-encompassing cornucopia of progressive desiderata, the Green New Deal, represents a desire among its advocates to shift the acceptable range of policy outcomes in this country. Many of its provisions have very little to do with environmental remediation. It guarantees federal employment. It provides tuition-free education to transition those who are in the fossil fuels and related industries away from their chosen career paths. It provides for universal basic income and, of course, Medicare for all, which Democrats often confuse with, quote, high-quality health care, when in fact it is merely the provision of medical insurance and would produce significant pressures on medical providers to withdraw from the marketplace. One of the former chief of staff to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Saikat Chakrabarti, said that we didn't originally think that this was a climate thing at all. It was a how do you change the entire economy thing, which is very much in line with a socialist view of how to remake the world and the world economy in a completely different conception than the capitalist ideal. Again, a departure from the social democratic model. Nevertheless, it attracted 60 co-sponsors in the House, 14 in the Senate, 8 2020 candidates adopted in whole or in part. You can go on and on. National rent control, which limits developers' incentives to build new housing and repair and renovate their properties when they don't simply convert them into condos. Universal childcare and preschool, expanding access to Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. I believe it was the Progressive Policy Institute scored all this. and found that it would cost approximately $53 trillion over the course of a decade. Now, advocates for this point of view believe that you can simply apply a theory of monetary theory that prescribes simply minting new currency in order to pay for these projects. But the other end of that theory is that you have to impose draconian taxes on individuals in order to mitigate inflationary pressures. You have to take money out of the economy. But no one has advocated the kind of taxes that would be necessary to reduce inflationary pressures, much less pay for something like that. We spent the last several months pumping $3 trillion into the economy. And we're facing the prospect now of accelerated timelines on which things like Medicare's hospital insurance fund, which its actuaries believe will go insolvent in 2026, has been pushed forward now. We're simply at the limits of our budgetary capacity to absorb these programs. Now, Joe Biden managed to sidestep a lot of these landmines, and he assumed the Democratic Party's nomination as a result. But the notion that he will serve as a bulwark against this change is betrayed by the polling. The 2019 Data for Progress poll found that 37% of Sanders supporters describe themselves as either Democratic Socialists or plain Socialists, not liberals. A May 2019 Mammoth poll showed that 60% of respondents believed that socialism takes away too many individual rights. Only 38% of Democrats said the same. And a February 2020 Gallup poll found that just about half of Americans, 45%, would be inclined to support a socialist president. By contrast, 76% of Democrats agreed and said that they would support a socialist. The enthusiasm and the media spotlight is all on the party's rising figures, some of whom are declared Democratic Socialists, others are not necessarily declared some Democratic Socialists, but their policy instincts differ only cosmetically from those of Democratic Socialists. It's quite clear that Democratic Socialism is rapidly remaking the Democratic Party, and it is very attractive to many of its voters and its members. It will certainly have a reciprocal effect on American politics as a whole. I remain unconvinced, however, that this effect will redound to the benefit of Democratic Socialists.
Thank you both. Michael, let me come back to you. So I hear you saying that there are these two strands of folks who call themselves Democratic Socialists in the United States, and that popular figures, important figures such as Bernie Sanders and AOC, you would describe more as European social democrats, and that to some extent they've described themselves that way. I hear Noah saying, well, if you look at the details of what they stand for, it's really far more radical. So I have a question for you about nomenclature and about marketing, if you will. I mean, given the association of the word socialist with some of history's worst regimes, including the USSR, why would folks try to reintroduce and not try? Why would they have succeeded in reintroducing that word to mainstream American politics? Why wouldn't they call themselves something else and talk about the sort of social safety net programs that you've described without using the label of socialist?
It's a good question. I mean, I can't speak for AOC or anybody else or Sanders, but there's a social tradition which, as you know and no one knows, goes back beyond and before tyrannical socialism of the USSR and China. And this is, I think, in a sense, those who call themselves socialists are trying to revive that idea of a democratic socialism. And I think also, there's a way to talk about a different kind of society. If you talk about, well, we're just far liberals, we're just progressives, if what you really want is a more collective commonwealth, as Eugene Debs, the famous Democratic Socialist, put it 100 years ago, then you want to talk about a vision which you share with people in Europe who call themselves socialists, even if they don't want to do away with capitalism root and branch. And I should also say, just to respond for a minute, just to Noah, the polling goes all over the place, I think. First of all, on whether you consider yourself a socialist or not, most people under 35 are friendly to that term, whatever their party happens to be. But a majority of Americans are friendly to and approve of pretty much every one of the planks in the Social Democratic platform that I mentioned. They believe that everybody should be covered by good health insurance, whether by a public option or by Medicare for all. They believe that everyone should have decent housing. They are favorable to, if not the Green New Deal, most of the planks within the Green New Deal. They want a lot more infrastructure. They want infrastructure which is sustainable, based on sustainable energy. I can go down the list. And so if socialists have a branding problem, the problem is not, I think, with the ideas, with the programs that they want to put forth, which are quite popular among a majority of Americans right now. The problem is, with the understandably very ruinous baggage of Stalin and Lenin and Mao and Fidel Castro. If I had another word for the vision that I laid out, and if people call themselves socialists had another word for that, we would use it. But there's some value, I think, in redefining a word, and especially now, one of the reasons young people, I think, are willing to define themselves that way is, of course, we are almost 30 years past the end of the Soviet Union, and most people like the idea of socialism, didn't live through that time. It's a distant memory. And also remember, people like Noah, I'm not sure Noah did this, but people like Noah, conservatives, called Barack Obama a socialist when he was, for most analyses, a rather centrist liberal Democrat, I think. And so a lot of people grew up as, of course, most people call themselves socialists now did during Obama's administration. If he's a socialist and the kind of things he was for, they thought were just kind of common sense, a lot of them, then maybe socialism is not so bad. So I'm not sure whether the term itself over time, depending on how it's used, of course, is going to be as much of a disability as you suggested is, Craig.
So no, let me come back to you. And you're suggesting that in the details of the policy proposals of these self-described socialist figures, there really is a radical transformational agenda. And I guess the question I have is, given the labyrinth of divided power in the United States, is the conservative, the stated conservative concern about the radicalism of the contemporary American left, is it legitimate? Is it a real concern about radical transformation, or is it a scare tactic that seeks to avoid the sort of far less apocalyptic vision that the United States, becomes more like Western Europe in the relationship between government and the economy?
Sure. Well, I think the United States as a political culture has a long way to go and a series of stops to make before it progresses along the progressive line towards European-style social democracy and then into collectivism and socialism. But the point you make about a rhetorical posture emphasizes something that Michael said, which I think is very valuable and needs to be highlighted. There were members of the conservative movement, I was perhaps a tad young, but not unsympathetic to this notion that Barack Obama's liberalism had progressed beyond the scale, beyond the limits of traditional democratic liberalism. No longer was this the party of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. This was a much more radical party. And the rhetorical excesses to which Republicans appealed perhaps contributed to the desensitization of the radicalism around actual socialism. And the reciprocal case is actually entirely true. And I don't think Democrats have fully reconciled with the fact that the notion that Republican voters were told repeatedly that George W. Bush was a racist and a fascist desensitized them to the notion that somebody would come along and actually represent quite a few of those ideals that exceeded the bounds of traditional American political ethos. Practicality is something that actually voters do care about. These sort of ephemeral notions, conceptual 30,000 feet notions of communitarian ideals do appeal. But when you get down into the nuts and bolts of it, it has its limits, even among Democratic voters. We were treated to, I think, 375 Democratic debates over the primary season, most of them focused at least some or most of the way through the debate on Medicare for all. It was a primary source of frustration among Democratic opponents. And so those of us who follow this very closely watched in shock as this proposal became less and less popular the more and more it was discussed. The trap, the landmines onto which Kamala Harris stepped are very instructive here. Bernie Sanders' bill, to which she was a co-sponsor, and many of the people on that stage were co-sponsors, had a provision in it, which was a necessary provision in order to make the thing work, which would criminalize, make illegal, most private health insurance, employer-sponsored health insurance. When she was asked about this by Jake Tapper on a stage in a town hall, she said, sure, let's do away with it. Let's get rid of all that stuff, very flippantly. It blew up in her face. It was a political debacle. She was forced to back off of it. She was forced to back off of this. And this is a provision that makes this bill score in a way that is palatable to American consumers and then the Congress that would have to pass it. And she was eventually had to get rid of it, had to back off this position. Just about everybody on that stage who co-sponsored this bill, who all knew what was in it, had to eventually back off this very key provision. It's the sort of things when you get into the nuts and bolts of it that'll make people say, well, the ideal is great. When you talk about the ideals, nobody disagrees with that notion. When you talk about actually making the policy work and how to fund these ideas, that's where you get into trouble. And that's not sort of hidebound American conservatism. That's a very practical conception of how politics works in this country. And it's one that I don't think you can simply get rid of by conditioning Americans or what have you. I mean, it is a function of being a political culture that is practical in its very nature and inclined towards compromise and not radical revisions of the social compact, which is a strength of the American system, not a detriment to it.
Can I respond real quickly?
Please.
Noah, I agree that if the Democrats manage to get control of the Senate again and expanded majority in the House, and of course Biden elected, and they tried to pass some of these bills. First of all, Biden would not try to pass Medicare for all. He's already said he wouldn't want to do that. But even if, let's say, Bernie Sanders had been elected president, then he would have had to compromise, of course. But there's also one of the things Democrats have done, and they've not been successful in doing over the last few decades, is compromising with themselves before they got to compromising with Republicans. And if you don't start with these ideals, you don't start with the goal, then you begin by compromising. And I think I'd be quite happy with a public option, for example, showing hopefully that government can administer a healthcare program as well or better and cheaper and more efficiently than private healthcare plans can. If it cannot do that, then Medicare for all will not be popular. So that's the policy that I favored. I did not do the campaign, favor Bernie Sanders. I favored Elizabeth Warren, partly because I thought she had a more realistic path to getting to some of these policies in the end that both she and Sanders want. But I think again this has to do not just with the compromise and of American politics, but also with how movements work. From my understanding of American history and history of every advanced industrial country, transformative change happens when movements from below push for fairly radical changes and then end up helping elect people who are able to carry out some of those programs, compromising, but from a position of strength, which the movements give them. And I think is what Democratic Socialists are doing, which Black Lives Matter has done, which other movements on the left have done over the last 10 to 12 years. So practically, I think that's how change really happens. And so that's how I would defend, socialists like myself arguing that, this is what we would like to have. But obviously, it's got to go through politics. And unless Democrats had massive majorities of like-minded representatives, and if Biden was Bernie Sanders, this would not happen the way they might like it to happen. But I'd be quite happy to have 60 or 70% of what they want.
So, Michael, I want to stay with you, and I want to stay in a way with this sort of definitional question. So, Elizabeth Warren, as you said, your favored candidate, was at pains to tell everybody she was not a socialist, that her program was about saving capitalism, and in her view, sort of resolving what she saw as as the serious problems of contemporary capitalism. So my question goes to, sort of what is at the heart of the vision and the demand of this new American left. And I want you to tell me if you think I have this right. And I think the argument is that contemporary American capitalism is failing on its own terms. You made reference to the Great Recession. That we're producing a degree of inequality that is called by people unacceptable and unsustainable. And there's the argument that the middle class is collapsing with the accoutrements of 20th century middle class life, college educations, home ownership, relative security and retirement, all becoming sort of less available for the millennials and subsequent generations, and that can only be corrected by significant redistributionist efforts by government. Do you think I have that right? That is the argument. That is the claim of the program.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah. And look, the reason I support Elizabeth Warren is not because I didn't agree with Bernie Sanders on a lot of things he was saying. It's on practical grounds. I don't think you can elect a socialist president without a larger socialist movement. And without DSA, which Noah mentioned, I'm a member of. It's a very broad organization. It includes people. I wish it didn't include people call them tankies. People who basically think it was fine to send tanks into Prague in 1968 and Budapest in 1956. These are not people I consider democratic socialists at all. And people like me, probably on the right of DSA. But they again, except for some of the very small group of born-again Leninists, I think most people agree on that critique that you laid out, Craig, and kind of solutions I'm talking about. And I think it's also important, however, that we think about the fact that Sanders was able to get a majority of young voters in the Democratic Party. And as we know, I mean, Ronald Reagan, way back, got a majority of young voters in the Republican Party on his side in 1980. George H.W. Bush had the older voters, and some of the other candidates ran that year had the older voters too. And that was a sign, I think, that he was, a wave of the future in American politics. Bernie Sanders won't be, because he's going to be in his 80s when the next election comes around. But I think it's important to note that, for all the, Noah talked about the impracticality of some of these ideas fiscally, which I could disagree with. That's a different matter. I think it's important to realize, who has, the excitement, the inspiration right now in American politics. It is these people on the left. And that, to me, is what ends up changing American politics, for better or worse. I think for better.
So Noah, let's go back to then that sort of the central argument of the left as I've posed it and Michael has agreed. Do you think it's true that American capitalism is producing too much inequality and a collapsing middle class?
No, I do not. One of the sources of frustration, if you're a conservative writer, is it can get really boring defending ideas that have been defended 100 times. There's no revolutionary politics in conservative thought. You are simply adhering to and defining ideas that have already been adhered to and defined by generations before them, but there are reasons why they are persistently valuable. In 1981, 42% of the population of the world lived in extreme poverty, defined as living on $1.9 per day. By 2008, 700 million people had escaped that condition, attributable primarily to the market-oriented reforms pursued by China and India, the dismantling of the Maoist economy and by Deng Xiaoping, the license Raj, this Byzantine economic structure that preserved social cohesion and made enterprise and innovation a very impractical proposition in India, was dismantled. And subsequently, we saw the flourishing of the human condition, an idea that is central to socialism and socialists, but has been achieved by markets. Likewise, you've seen American standards of living increase commensurate. There will always be inequality in any system. Arguably, socialist systems pursue a very similar form of social inequality, which is defined not by wealth but status. and status is something that is attributable to the human condition. It is not something that can be legislated away, even in systems that specifically pursue those outcomes. But I think the record of capitalism speaks for itself, as long as you're willing to speak for it. It takes a certain amount of courage, because Michael is correct. The amount of energy and enthusiasm that you see on the revolutionary left, the social democratic left, is mirrored in the press, and it's difficult to generate that kind of enthusiasm for the market-oriented ideas of the Enlightenment, to multiple century-old ideas. But nevertheless, they need to have champions, and I do think that the record is very difficult to run away from if you're truly interested in the flourishing of the human condition.
So no, let me stay with you for a moment then. Conservatives are quick to point out the success of market economics around the world in the last generation and beyond that. But there are issues, right, where the market doesn't provide a satisfactory solution. The classic case being environmental policy, where the common good of a livable environment is an externality in the pricing of the market mechanisms. So there once was a time, it seems to me, when there was a lot of conservative thinking about how to use market mechanisms to address some of the issues that were sort of raised by the left, including how to get universal access to health insurance and how to get a better environmental regulation, or indeed any environmental regulation. And there was a lot of policy proposals on the conservative side about those things. Indeed, what became Obamacare, right, started as a Heritage Foundation policy paper presented to Ronald Reagan and was first implemented by Governor Romney in Massachusetts. And there was a lot of, you had the Jack Kemp and Paul Ryan kind of talk about empowerment concepts to deal with poverty. So there was conservative thought about how to use market mechanisms to address problems that maybe had been primarily raised and put on the agenda by the left. I don't see that at this point. I see the right perhaps denying the existence of the problems that the left is seeking to use as a stepping stone to power.
Well, they might be, but I'm certainly not. Let's take the environment as the example that you've settled out. I by no means would concede 1 inch to the notion that markets are ill-equipped to address environmental remediation and global warming and climate change. In 2017, U.S. per capita carbon emissions declined by their 3rd consecutive year to 2.7%, a 67-year low, despite a 28% increase in economic growth, a rise in GDP up to $20 trillion. This wasn't achieved by federal fuel efficiency mandates. It was achieved by markets. The all-electric vehicle with crowded out hybrid cars from the marketplace, which was something the Obama administration sunk a lot of subsidies into and never caught on with the market because it was inefficient. Hydraulic fracturing, not federal mandates, resulted in cleaner burning natural gas, a bridge fuel to a sustainable future, which was fought every step of the way by anti-market advocates. We've seen the emissions from fossil fuel generating power plants has declined to a 1985 level lows. Now, there's certainly a lot to say for public-private partnerships like Energy Star, which is something that Green New Deal advocates dismiss as a half measure. But you cannot say that this is not progress, and it is progress that contrasts mightily with socialist societies, where in the 20th century were places that put a premium not on social stability and growth, dramatic, fast, rapid economic growth, not the environment. Some of the worst environmental disasters in human history occurred in places like Soviet Russia. 15% of Russian city dwellers today breathe clean air. The Aral Sea was diverted into oblivion by Stalinist irrigation projects. Chinese air, for example, is unbreathable on some of the best days. Public officials look, and these are places that people say, well, look, they have the best environmental laws on the books, and it's true on paper, but public officials look the other way and do not enforce these laws. Whereas in societies where you have an actual rule of law, mature capitalist Republican democracies like ours, they are enforceable, and they aren't, people do not privilege the environment, or rather social stability and economic growth over the environment. And why is that? And there's a study that demonstrated this in 1994. Gene Grossman and Alan Kruger demonstrated that one of the biggest indicators, the foremost leading indicator of a society that will pursue environmental remediation in a stable environment, is a stable middle class. In very, very crass terms, you get the environment you can afford. And economic growth is a precursor to an environment that is stable and provides for future generations. So no, I do not concede 1 inch to the notion that the markets are not an effective force for environmentalism. They are the most effective force.
Can I respond a little bit, or do you want to go to questions?
No, please do.
Well, first of all, Noah's, is arguing with the Soviet Union, not with Denmark here, or the Netherlands, or Finland. I didn't, obviously, I'm as opposed to a revival of the Soviet Union or Mao's China, as you are, Noah. But I thought it was ironic that on one hand, you praise, the marketization of China, which obviously has lifted 300 million people out of dire poverty, and I think that's true. At the same time, you criticize China for, environmental degradation. And also, it's fair to say that China, went from a primitive, what Marx would call primitive accumulation economy, shared poverty, to a situation where the way to make it in China is to work in working conditions much like those Engels wrote about in Manchester in the 1840s, or existed in the United States in the late 19th century. So, this is not a society with a very large middle class. For the most part, the prosperity of China in the last 30, 40 years has been made by peasants moving to the cities and working in, way over time, environmentally hazardous factories. So this has not become some kind of paradise, obviously, of capitalism. Environmental stuff, well, I haven't got the figures here at my fingertips, but every report I've seen by United Nations scientists and many others has shown that things are getting worse, that temperatures are rising, there's more environmental hazard, the storms are getting worse, and to the degree that electric cars, the market for electric cars, as I understand, is still pretty damn small. And the idea that this is going to make a difference, especially when they're quite expensive than gasoline cars still, and the fact that we're going to do away with the coal industry, with the petroleum industry, because these industries are going to, decide voluntarily to stop selling these products without, a lot of pressure from the government to change, I think is naive. That's not historically the kind of thing that usually happen. As long as you're making money, an industry wants to keep making money. That seems to be, that's one of the ethics of capitalism. Profit.
Right.
If you're making profits, you want to continue making profits. You want to continue to maximize, profits for your shareholders, as Milton Friedman famously, argued. Anyway.
Well, one of the reasons why the coal industry is facing so much.
I'm sorry.
Just one of the reasons why the coal industry is facing the pressures that it is not government mandates. I mean, there was a concerted effort for 8 years under the Obama administration to make life very difficult for coal. What really did them in was the notion that you could no longer make a profit in coal as a result of abundant, affordable natural gas, which was the result of hydraulic fracturing technology. Again, the marketplace delivered the mechanism by which coal became virtually obsolete, not public sector mandates. And the reason why we have this, China-European debate is we're trying to nail down our terms here, as we were discussing earlier. Social democracy and socialism are not synonymous. And there are times in which democratic socialists in America want to make the case that they are just simply European Democrats, when, as I argued earlier, the European Democrats are well to the right of democratic socialists in America. Socialism as a vestigial construct in China has resulted in, again, the kind of statism that you correctly say, Michael, is truly oppressive. But what got swept away were the socialist aspects of the marketplace. What Deng Xiaoping began to abandon in 1978 was central planning, was collective farming, was protective trade deals and tariffs, and they sold off state-owned industry. That's what they got rid of. They didn't get rid of the state controls, but the state controls are what you need in order to pursue a socialist reformation. You have to have a very strongly empowered state, perhaps not anywhere near, and we shouldn't be cavalier about this, nowhere near the kind of state that was envisioned by Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, but most certainly a much more powerful state than the one that exists right now. And that state can compel you and coerce you to engage in activity that you would otherwise not be inclined to do. Now, socialists believe that they're going to be using that kind of power for good. It is the nature of the American system that will eventually deprive socialists of this power and deliver it into the hands of their adversaries. And I, as a conservative, are rather concerned about what my adversaries would do with that omniscience.
I think, again, social programs are not popular. They will be voted out like everything else in our democracy. Sorry.
Let me just remind our audience to submit any questions that they'd like at this point. We have a couple questions that I'd like to start with. The first is to you, Noah. What do you think about carbon taxes as a way to push for clean energy and reduce the use of fossil fuels?
Yeah, I'm agnostic on the matter. I have not researched it enough to have an informed opinion. This is very bad punditry to say, I don't know, but I honestly don't. It is not my field, and so I can't weigh in on it with any authority. I know some conservatives are attracted to it, some are not, but I don't know the effect of that as public policy.
Okay.
I can say it depends. I think it depends how high they are. They're not going to do much good if they're too low. You know, there's a debate among social democrats about that too.
So we have a question that's for both of you, and that is, you've both talked about that American politics requires compromise, and that neither side's going to get everything they want. So the question for you, Noah, are there any ideas or policies of the Democratic Socialist movement that you think hold value, would be good to implement? And likewise, for you, Michael, are there elements of what you would consider a conservative platform that you can live with? So the question is really, what's the basis of compromise, as this questioner says, to save American politics?
Well, Michael mentioned something earlier that I thought, and this is more ideological on my part than I think probably the premise of the question would allow for, but nevertheless, the notion here that, and I'm not sure if this is a democratic socialist platform per se, but the energy is certainly on the left in its pursuit, which is the reformation of domestic policing policies and the effort to curtail the sort of abuses that occur to some extent. We haven't nailed down the extent, but to some extent in local police forces. This is a much more libertarian conception of democratic socialism than I've encountered. And it's one that I can certainly get behind. So there are some social and generally broad conceptual goals I think are shared broadly by most of the American political spectrum. It's when you get into the details that things get to become a little more complicated.
Michael, do you think there's a basis for compromise?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a sensibility that I believe conservatives have, at least traditional conservatives have had, which I am sympathetic to, and that's Edmund Burke, Reflections on Revolution in France. Probably no one would expect me to quote Burke here, but you know, Burke, as you both probably know, and Noah certainly does, you know, talked about how traditions should not just willy-nilly be trashed. Institutions should not be done away with unless it can be proved that they really don't work. You know, unless it can be proved that they really are not fulfilling the purposes for which they were created, and because people have very deep affections for them, sometimes because they've worked for them, sometimes because, you know, they just have deep affections for them for various cultural reasons, even religious reasons, of course. I you don't want to go into Burke's specifics here, but I do think that if, and you mentioned this before, Craig, if the institutions I'm talking about really worked for a majority of Americans, if a majority of Americans were happy with them, whatever the institution might be, and we're not in favor of making changes to them to give every citizen dignity and respect, make sure that people are not going hungry and avoiding medical care because they can't afford it, then I would not take the position I would take. I'm not someone who thinks, as some early socialists actually did, well, the market system by its very nature is unjust, will always be unjust. It has to be proven. Marx said that capitalism was a revolutionary system, and he's right, and it keeps changing things. And if it changed things with regulation enough to make it viable, then I'd be fine with that. The problem is more and more has not done that, I think. And that's why I'm in favor of what Noah would consider more radical changes, though not doing away with the basics of the market system.
So I would like to add, because I've been very focused on nitty-gritty programmatic details, that from a conceptual level or real philosophical idea, Democratic Socialists offer a very valuable critique of the American system insofar as they are focused on inequality. And while I do not share their assessment that the American economic and political system delivers the kind of inequality they see, the perception of inequality is a very dangerous thing. And very deleterious to the social fabric and social stability. And it is absolutely critical for American policymakers to be focused on addressing both the substance and the perception of substantial economic inequality, and the idea that American social strata are not permeable. If that idea were to take hold, it would be very dangerous for the American civic compact.
So Noah, we have a question that is directly related to what you just said. The question is, if conservatism and capitalism is capable of solving the income divide, then why is it getting worse to the point that families can't support themselves even on 2 incomes?
Yeah, well, again, I do not concede the point that income inequality is getting vastly worse. It is the nature of the development of the economic system that over the course of the last 50 years after the post-war dividend, that yes, the dollar has not gone as far as it used to, and that the 2-parent household is no longer a viable thing for much of the American middle class. And that is a source of, again, a valuable critique from the socialist left. Their prescriptions would, I believe, exacerbate these conditions. They would not ameliorate them. They would make them worse. They would make the tax burdens more onerous. They would make the pressures on the nuclear family more intense. And you can go into the details about this, but this is a 30,000-foot perspective. Again, I think a philosophical approach to this, it's a valuable critique. Programmatically, it is very deeply flawed. And the notion that there is more inequality today than in, say, 1961 is simply a fallacy. We're talking about economic inequality. You can make that argument. You want to talk about every other aspect of inequality? It's not one that is a viable argument.
How about 69?
I'm sorry?
How about 1969 as opposed to 61?
What about 1969?
A lot changed in 61 and 69. Anyway, I don't want to.
Oh, well, okay. Just picked out a random Democratic administration. Out of
So, Michael, let me sort of stay with you on this question. You've talked a lot about what I would call the social safety net programs that are advocated by or advocated for on the part of the left. But I want to bring you this question directly about economic inequality. Bernie Sanders would go to every rally, and he would talk about how the Walton family that created Walmart, just the family itself, had more wealth than the majority of Americans, and there was at least implicit the notion that is inherently wrong and that government needs to change it. So what do you think ought to be the goal with respect to government policy on economic equality? Is there a number that should be aimed for? Is there a maximum amount of wealth that a person or a family ought to be able to have? How does one deal with that in specific terms?
Well, first of all, I return to the high marginal tax rates that we had in the 50s and 60s, which were over 80% at one point. And that would create more revenue, obviously, for the government. I don't know how much, because I'm not an economist and have to work that out, but certainly more. And capital gains tax would be increased as well. But also, I think a lot of it has to do with institutions. I mean, one of the reasons why there was the great compression, as people talk about it, in the late 40s up until the early 70s existed, was because labor unions were much stronger. And both Democratic governments and especially, of course, Republican ones have tried to whittle down the power of organized labor, especially public workers for Republicans. But in general, there's much less protection for union organizers now than there was back in the 50s and the 60s. And in polls, again, a lot of, majority of Americans say they're favorable to labor unions. I forget the number, recent poll I saw, something like 35 or 40% of American workers who aren't unions say they'd like to have a union. And this, if that happened, that'd be above the union density figure at the height of union membership in the United States, which was in the mid-1950s, was about 35% of the labor force, non-coastal labor force was in unions. So I think I'd leave it up more to, again, to get democratic institutions like unions and, of course, like the Democratic Party to push for changes. And, I wouldn't put a number on it. Certainly, I mean, is right. When people feel the society is really unequal, then either they get depressed and cynical about it and withdraw from politics, or what I would hope, and I think is happening to a large degree now, they do get involved in activism at various levels. And I think that is the only way, really, in which really democratic change can happen, and in which inequality will be reduced. It'll never be done away with again. Again, I'm not a utopian socialist. I'm a practical socialist, market socialist, you might say, a social democrat. But I think that only when you've got strict regulations on corporations, when you've got programs that are, I think, job creation programs like part of the Green New Deal, which would pay union wages. And among other things, I mean, how obscene is it that we have a federal minimum wage, which is still $7.25 an hour, at a time when, clearly you need, close to $50 an hour to have a decent income that can support a family, and probably two people earning $50 an hour. So, there's all kinds of changes that can make society a lot less unequal. But again, it will depend on pressure from below and from the middle for it to happen.
No, there's a third option. There's a third option there. And Michael said there are two things that can happen to you when you become despondent with the political system. One is you withdraw from politics and become depressed and don't want to do anything about it. The second is you get involved, become an activist. The third is to radicalize. The third is to become convinced of the fundamental injustice of the system and resolve to attack its foundations because it is wholly illegitimate. And that is something we're seeing more and more of in not just fringe commentary, but in legitimate circles of political commentary and opinion and analysis in this country. This is one of my primary frustrations with social justice, that I go into it in the book, is that its adherents are increasingly inclined to abandon Rawlsian thought, John Rawls style social justice, the conception of which is to create a distributionist model that would operate from behind a veil of ignorance, blind you to the beneficiaries of your distribution so you can have an optimal distribution of the finite commodity of justice that exists in the universe. The veil is a problem now for social justice advocates. They no longer perceive equality to be the goal. The perception now is that we need downward social leveling, punishments meted out to those who deserve it, a confiscatory tax regime that doesn't meet revenue targets. We don't even know what the revenue targets are. It's to rob the people who deserve to be robbed of that which is their ill-begotten gain, to steal from them the privileges they acquired at birth, of which they may not even be aware, that are creating the kind of social conditions that are so onerous and burdensome on people. This is a very envious psychological construct that they've created for themselves, and it can manifest in something far more radical than I think their advocates in respectable circles are willing to entertain.
So we have 2 minutes left, and that sounded to me like Noah's closing statement. So I come to you, Michael, to give you the last word.
Well, again, thanks for this dialogue. I wish we had more time. I've enjoyed it, and hearing from Noah and hearing from Craig and some of the questions. Well, I mean, basically my answer to what Noah just said is if you don't want, those you consider to be the crazy radicals to gain, then solve the problems that give rise to crazy radicalism. And what I'm in favor of, and I think, most of the people on the left of the Democratic Party who I identify with are in favor of, are making the kinds of reforms which I think would make this a much more just society. And so, some of the people, who are, tearing down statues of, Abraham Lincoln, or something, would be laughed at, because, whenever you have just unhappiness in society, any society, you've got people who are arguing for rather crazy, ideas that most people will not support, and you've got, I think a radical middle, if you will, of the left, which hopefully ends up winning. And so I think, focus on those in the Democratic Party trying to make these changes. Don't focus on people online or maybe in the streets who are arguing for, killing the rich or something, because that's not a mass phenomenon, I don't think, or a mass sentiment. And it'll become much less of a mass sentiment the more America becomes a just society.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank both of our guests, and I thank our audience. We'll see you again next time. We're adjourned.